Hey, Sens fans, welcome to Season 5, Episode 25 of the Senstennial Podcast. Today, we're really excited to welcome on Scott Wheeler from The Athletic to talk to us about all things prospects and the 2024 NHL Draft. So, Scott, thanks for joining us this evening.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, I'm very stoked to have you. Been a long time reader of yours, and it's kind of cool to have you on our podcast now. So
Well, it's 6 p.m. on a Thursday here, and I'm not doing anything else. My kids are actually out of the house with my wife right now. They went to the park, and so I said
nice.
I'll just stick behind and do some dishes after dinner and hop on with you guys. So we're good.
Excellent. That's awesome. Well, I think we'll dive on in. So in your May 9th mock draft, you had the Sens taking Zayne Parekh with their seventh overall selection. And then in your most recent mock, you had them taking Zeev Buium. And then in an Ian Mendez article, you recently also spoke about defensive prospect Sam Dickinson. So it obviously seems that you believe, and rightfully so, that Ottawa should be taking a defender in this draft. But what's your opinion on each of these defenders and why they would be a good fit for the Sens?
Well, I think you have to start with the handedness,
Yeah.
just because of the way that the Sens are set up on the left side. Now, they've got a decision to make on Thomas Chabot and Jacob Chikrin, right? Like the push comes to shove. Are those two? Is one of them? Are both of them going to be a part of the long term vision here? And what does that look like if they are with Jake Sanderson also on the left side? So that decision, one way or another, will probably need to be made. If not, at least publicly, it'll probably need to be made in Steve Staios's head before they make this pick. Because if they're going to take a left-handed defenseman, it's going to impact what that looks like long term. Now, Zeev Buium and Sam Dickinson are lefties. Zayne Pareks a righty. Carter Yakimchuk is a righty. So there's variety in that range in terms of what those D look like. I think all things being equal, they'd obviously love to grab a righty, as most teams would. But there's a chance that if they don't like Zayne Parekh, or if Zayne Parech's not their guy, if he's not their number one choice, there's a chance that the best player available there is a left-handed defenseman. And I don't think that they're in a position, with their pool being what it is, and if I'm being blunt, it's one of the weaker prospect pools in the league right now. And if they're not in a position of strength, which they aren't, it's probably the move to just take the lefty and figure it out further down the line. Obviously, Chikrin's got an expiring deal and hasn't really locked into anything at this point. They've got big decisions to make there, but Sam Dickinson is a stud. Sam Dickinson's a two-way horse. He is an excellent skater, one of the better skating D in the draft, and that's saying something when you're 200 pounds and 6'3", and you can really move like that. Really strong defensive game, one of the best defenders in the draft, but has also really developed his offensive game. He's played a smarter game this year. There, for a long time, there were criticisms of his decision making, his reads, his sort of IQ, if you will. I thought that came a long way this year. He scored 20 goals in the OHL this year, which is not easy to do as a defenseman. And would be a lot more impressive if Zayne Parekh hadn't scored, I think it was 33 goals.
Yeah.
But very impressive numbers regardless. He ran their top power play unit on and off this season. And when he wasn't on the first unit, he was on the second unit. There's some offense there. I think he's going to be an excellent, excellent top four defenseman. Zeev Buium just had one of the best college hockey seasons in recent memory. I've been doing this job for 11 years now. This will be my 11th draft class, and he had as good a year as anybody I've watched at the college level at that age. That's including Owen Power, Charlie McAvoy, both Hughes brothers. It's a pretty impressive list. He had one of the best draft eligible seasons by an NCAA D ever. So, and on top of that, won a national championship. Was the first pair. It was a first pairing defenseman on a Denver team that went all the way. Obviously, was a big part of as an underager of the World Junior team, which won gold in Gothenburg. So just a tremendous season. His game tilts more to offense, but I actually think he defends at a very high level as well. Very mobile player, sort of a smooth, efficient play steering, possession defender who can really make things happen with how active he is offensively and his feet and jumping off the line and shaking past guys. And there are all sorts of layers to his game. So those are the two lefties. And then the righty in Zayne is just a sort of magical offensive defenseman, right? The criticism of Zayne's game is that it's one hand on his stick a lot of the time defensively. He's not a particularly hard, physical, super competitive kid. Defends primarily with his stick and his feet. He's not big on box outs or in the corners or shot blocking or that kind of a thing. But the offensive smarts are elite, like special. And the offensive talent to go with those offensive smarts is also special. And as a result, you've got a kid who posted almost 100 points and had the best offensive season by a draft-eligible OHL defenseman that I've ever seen. That's including Evan Bouchard, who is a 70-point defenseman in the NHL now. Pavel Mintyukov was really good. Brant Clark was really good. You really have to go all the way back to Ryan Ellis to find numbers sort of in that range, right? So very different player than the other two, but he's a righty, and the power play upside is pretty unique. And obviously the comparison in play style for him all year has kind of been Erik Karlsson. Now, I think Karlsson's a first ballot Hall of Famer, 3 Norris trophies. I don't think you can expect that from Zayne. But even if let's say he's Mike Green, right? Prime Mike Green, who was just that pure offensive defenseman. That's a high-end player. Mike Green was a big part of that blue line and a big part of that power play with Nick Backstrom and Alex Ovechkin for a long, long time. So all three in their different ways, I think, offer a lot and will be immediately, without question, the best prospect in the Sens pool by a long shot. That's no disrespect to Stephen Holiday and some of the guys who've had nice seasons, but they're just not anywhere near that echelon, right? So just a big moment really for the Sens and for whatever their future looks like. Like it's incumbent on them to make sure they get this one right. And it's also the start for Steve Staios of putting his blueprint on the draft, right?
Yeah.
Fingerprint
absolutely.
on the draft, I should say.
Yeah. I also want to give a special shout out to, you wrote an article a couple of years ago talking about how incredible that playoff run that Karlsson went on. And I always remembered that because I always felt like that was peak God tier defensive, like offensive player. Like he was exceptional. And that was like in the prime of Crosby, and he was going toe to toe with that. So I just wanted to give that.
I said it in the article, but Erik Karlsson at that point in time was probably the best player in the world. And that was in a league that had Evgeny Malkin, Sidney Crosby in their primes, right? Like go down the list. He was different then.
Yeah, definitely. And I just feel like even at that point, he was a better player than his 100-point season he had. Like they were different players for sure, but that season you can look back at that. That's why we love hockey. You can romanticize it because it was exceptional. But back to this draft. And going off that first question, we spoke a lot about defensemen and that there are quite a few top tier defensemen available, but do you think there's a possibility that the Sens could find a partner that could trade up for their 7 spot and they move back and still get one of those defensemen?
I don't think they can move back very far if that's the plan. I expect that there's really 6 premium D in this draft. I expect that 5 of them are gone in the first 7 or 8 picks and that the 6th one is gone by 11 or 12. Like that's just how it's going to play out in this year's draft. I think obviously Macklin Celebrini, you start to do the math about the guys who can go in that range. Macklin Celebrini and Ivan Demidov will be gone early. After that, it widens up a little bit. You'll have Berkly Catton get picked. I think you'll have Cayden Lindstrom get picked. Probably the 3rd forward off the board will be Cayden Lindstrom, assuming his health checks out. Then you'll have probably one of Berkly Catton or Tij Iginla sort of in that top 10 range. And then those other guys are going to linger. You're going to have 1 or 2 or 3 of Catton, Iginla, Beckett Seneke, Konsta Helenius. A couple of those guys are going to linger into the teens. Cole Eiserman. You're going to see some of those players available at 14, 15. So if they like one of those forwards, I think there's probably a better move to be made to move back and grab one of those forwards than there is one of the defensemen, because the defenseman will be gone early. But I think there's a really good chance that 2 or 3 sort of high-end forwards linger maybe a little bit longer than people expect them to.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you for that. And actually, it segues perfectly because I was going to say there's some pretty solid forwards up there too. And like you mentioned, with a lot of the defense probably going early, aside from obviously Celebrini is a forward who's going to get taken first overall, barring some insane draft happenings. Is there one guy in particular that, if Ottawa was to forgo picking a defenseman in favor of a forward at that 7 spot, that you see as being very valuable and that you could make a strong case for understanding why they would go that route instead of going for a defensive player?
Well, I think certainly if a player like Cayden Lindstrom, Berkly Catton, Tij Iginla, if any of those 3 guys are players that they're high on, there is a case to be made in that sort of 6 to 9 range that those guys belong there. Cayden's the X factor in that I think Cayden would be a top 5 pick if not for questions about his back. I wrote a feature on Cayden this week, and it's reported in the feature, but it's my understanding that according to his agency at least, that they were going to send 2 reports to NHL Central Scouting, who was then going to distribute them to the 32 NHL clubs. One was from his physiotherapist that he's been working with, and one is from the doctor and physician that's been working on him, who is actually a team physician as well. So those were expected to say that his back's going to make a full recovery, that they don't believe it's going to require surgery, and that this is just a process that he's still going through to get healthy. In saying that, and I didn't get this confirmed for the story, but it's my expectation that he's not going to participate in the testing at the Combine in Buffalo next week, or a week and a half from now at this point. And as a result, he's going to get a lot of questions about that and where his back's at. I think there are likely teams that will be spooked by it, not because they should be necessarily, but because teams saw what happened with Gabe Vilardi, for example, where it took Gabe Vilardi, who was a top 10 pick, years to get healthy and play in the NHL and become the player that everybody believed he could be. And he had an excellent season this year in Winnipeg, but the back is still something that he's dealing with. So that's the X factor. I could see a team like the Sens with the way that they've drafted in the past. And I know that Steve Staios is going to try to do things a little bit differently than Pierre Dorion did, but a lot of those scouts are still holdovers from that regime. And the way they drafted in the past, they loved athletic, hardworking, two-way, physically mature, well-rounded players. And that's Cayden Lindstrom. He's a power forward type who gets after it, can fly, obviously a premium athlete, physical, scores goals, drives to the net, plays that sort of classic NHL center game. And so he's an interesting one. If they feel that they can wait on the back to sort itself out, or they're confident that it's going to heal and be fine for next season, or whatever it is, and he's available, he'd be a player that I could see them passing on a defenseman, for example, to take. Now, how much confidence do I have that they're going to say the same thing about Berkly Catton or Tij Iginla, for example? Probably a little bit less, if only because the teams are a little bit more polarized on those players. There are teams that absolutely love Tij Iginla, that think he's a top 5, top 6 talent in this draft. And I've spoken with people about Tij Iginla who think that he's not all that he's been made up to be in the public sphere, and that he's not a top 10 guy kind of thing. And same with Berkly Catton, with this way that Berkly Catton skates and his skill level, dynamic talent, but he's a 5'10" center. And there are teams that don't love the idea of spending a top 10 pick on a 5'10" center, right? So it's hard to predict some of those forwards. Cole Eiserman's another one who once upon a time was going to be a 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th overall pick in this draft, and now likely won't be a top 10 pick and might not even be a top 15 one. So, and has all sorts of varied opinions on him. So it's hard to pinpoint where the forwards are going to go, if only because they're not universally well liked in the way that, frankly, Zeev Buium is. Like, everybody loves Zeev Buium. Even Sam Dickinson, who some people question the smarts and the IQ, people still have a ton of respect for Sam Dickinson in the season he had in London, and he's still going to be a big part of the Memorial Cup in the next week and a half here. And so there's the defensemen are just the easier ones to sort of prognosticate for.
Yeah, it seems like wherever the Sens go, it's going to be
They're going to get a great player.
Exactly. And you just hope that they get the best one, sort of thing. But then later in the first, in your most recent mock, you had the Sens taking Liam Greentree. And in your opinion, who else could be in that range on draft day that you believe our listeners should maybe know the names of?
Well, if they go D at 7, I think what becomes interesting is that in this draft, once those top 6, 7 D are gone, there are really 2 D that have emerged in that sort of next tier, maybe 3, depending on the way you feel about EJ Emery. And those 2 players are Stian Solberg, who has really burst into the teens, early 20s range with his play at the Men's Worlds for Norway and his play in the Norwegian playoffs for Vålerenga. And Adam Jiricek, who was coming out of last summer in the Hlinka Gretzky Cup, viewed as a potential top 10 pick in this draft, and then lost his season to a knee injury on Boxing Day on his first shift of the World Juniors and didn't play and hasn't played since, which creates huge question marks after teams just haven't seen you. A lot like it does with Aaron Kiviharju, who lost his season to a knee injury, and obviously Cayden Lindstrom to the back. So there are all sorts of tricky questions about Jiricek, but the beauty is that as a result, because there's not a ton of D expected to go in kind of the 15 to 30 range, once the premium ones are gone, there's going to be some very good forwards there. So if they take a D at 7, suddenly you might still get a high end forward. Now you're not getting a Tij Iginla or a Beckett Seneke or Konsta Helenius or a Berkly Catton or any of those guys at sort of the mid 20s. But that next tier has some players that I really, really like. I like Michael Hage of the Chicago Steel a lot. Michael was a top prospect in Ontario, would have been a first, second, third overall pick into the OHL had he gone to the OHL. Instead, his agency and him made the decision to go play for the Chicago Steel and do what Owen Power and Adam Fantilli, who were also top prospects in Ontario, did, which is go to the Chicago Steel and then go to the University of Michigan and spend a year or 2 at the University of Michigan before turning pro. And I think Hage has now reemerged after losing last season to shoulder surgery as a 16-year-old in the USHL. I thought he really reemerged this season. I wrote a feature on him in at the Athletic. He's been through a lot in the last year, not just with losing his 16-year-old season to shoulder surgery, but also by losing his father in a very tragic pool accident last summer over the Canada Day long weekend. He wasn't himself, I didn't think, in the first half of this season. But in the second half of this season, he was one of the best players in the USHL and looked like a top 15 prospect to me. I've had him sort of 14, 15, 16, 17 on my list, and yet I think there's a chance he's available when the Sens pick. I believe they're slotted at 25 for that second pick via Boston, right? So, he's a player who I could like. I think he has a chance to become a second line center in the NHL, and to get that in the late first round is a huge value, right? So he's a player that I would circle in that range. There's going to be a lot of wingers in that range, guys like Emil Hemming, Liam Greentree, wingers with size and scoring who maybe aren't the most complete players. Greentree's skating is a bit of an issue. Hemming's inconsistency has been a bit of an issue, but both big, strong, sort of 6'2" wingers that can really shoot the puck and have produced at a level that screams first round pick kind of thing. So that piece will be interesting. Jet Luchenko's another one, a center out of the Guelph Storm who had a really strong second half and could be available in that range. Cole Baudouin's a kid I did a feature on recently who's an Ottawa boy, sort of from Canada, and has grown up in the area after starting his life in Europe when his dad played professional hockey over in Europe. He's a two-way 200-foot center, sort of penalty killer, really good in the face-off circle, works his ass off, high energy, has a little bit of offense. He's probably a third-line center if he hits, but I think he's got a real opportunity to be a darn good third-line center, and those guys don't grow on trees either. So there's a lot of forwards in that range who could sort of be in the conversation for the Sens.
Now, you already touched on this player, but I kind of want to go back to it because, like you said, heading into this season, they had a lot of hype around them. And of course, the injury that kept them out for half the season devalued where they were in the rankings, and that's Adam Jiricek. Now, he's obviously a right-handed defenseman. And if Ottawa was to go forward in the top 10, do you think he's a guy that maybe around 25? I know potentially they might have to trade up a bit to get him, but would that be like a worthwhile risk to take, knowing that, hey, this is a guy who is potentially like a top 10, maybe top 15 talent coming into the season? And if you can snag him in the 20s, then maybe you can get a forward and defenseman that are both, high end draft picks to add to your prospect system, which, like you said, has not a lot of shine on it right now.
Yeah, I think that's the range where I'd feel comfortable, even with a little bit of risk, taking that kind of a swing. And that's because everybody in that range comes with a little bit of risk. The true top guys are gone. You're hoping to just get a good NHL player there. You're not looking to get a star. And Jiricek has an opportunity, if all goes well and he stays healthy and he gets back on track, to become a good NHL, like a solid top 6 NHL defenseman. He has shown against his peers, against his age group, both internationally and at the junior level in Czechia, that he can command a game offensively, that he can involve himself in transition, that he can run a power play. At the pro level, he's shown at least that he can hang. He's got size. He's still got room to fill out his frame. His frame's a little wiry, but he's 6'2". Like he's not a small kid. And he's just gotta get stronger and get back in the game action. Now, I think he may be gone by 25. Now there's a chance that he's there, but I think because of the lack of defensemen in that second tier, sort of the lack of defensemen that teams are going to be considering in the 15 to 30 range, guys like him, guys like Solberg, guys like EJ Emery, they're going to go in the teens, I think. And that's just because the draft always shapes up that way. There's always a team or two in every 10 picks that wants and desires to take a D with that selection. So it's just inevitable, whether they belong or not, it's inevitable that those three guys will go. And I think all three of those guys are frankly fine picks in that range. So could one of those three be available at 25? Sure. But I think Jiricek, just with the pedigree that he had before this season, is probably the least likely of those three to be available, even with the injury.
It feels like a foregone conclusion that he's going to San Jose. That's every mock I've ever seen. That's where he's going. So signed, sealed, delivered, I think.
San Jose, especially because they're obviously taking Macklin first. San Jose's pool is really strong at forward at the moment. Macklin, Celebrini, Will Smith, Philip Beestet, David Edstrom, they acquired from Vegas via trade. Quentin Musty, you go down the list. It's a really good group at forward. And on defense, it's Shakir Mukhamadullin and Luca Cagnoni and not a lot else. So I would imagine they'll be among the teams at 14 that will strongly consider a D, whether that's Jiricek or maybe even Solberg if they're high enough on him after his performance at Worlds. It really does feel like Solberg has moved from sort of early day 2 pick, like a 30s, 40s guy in the top of the second round. It feels like he's moved firmly into the sort of middle of the first round range.
Wow.
So it seems like, just from gathering what you laid out here, that if you were Ottawa, you would gravitate more towards going for that defenseman in that top 10 area, because there's not a lot of D after that. So I assume that in that range, it makes the most sense for Ottawa, regardless of handedness, go for the best player available, which is likely a defenseman. And then later on in the first, try to pick up one of those forwards who you can add to this core and, help them move along in the process of maybe finally breaking that playoff drought.
Yeah, I think that's probably the play, and it's probably the most likely outcome.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, as the prospects are now for Ottawa, who out of who we have are you maybe the most bullish on, and why?
Well, certainly Holiday's had a nice run here, not just in Belleville, which has obviously been impressive, and in the playoffs and all of that, but really in college, you go all the way back to his Dubuque days. I know the GM in Dubuque really well, and he pumps his tires and thinks he's an incredibly intelligent player. I think that's what always stands out about Stephen Holiday, is that despite the fact that he's 6'3", he doesn't really play the power forward game or the chip and chase game or the forechecking game. He's all about smarts and finding open ice and distributing. And yeah, I hate using comparables, but he kind of, and he's never going to be this. Obviously, Joe Thornton's an all-time great, but that's kind of the style, right? Like he likes to have the puck along the boards, and he doesn't like to have the puck along the boards so that he can drive to the net necessarily. He likes to have the puck along the boards because he can see the inside of the ice and make plays to his teammates. He makes his line mates better. We're just such a smart sort of intellectual hockey player offensively. And then on top of that, add some size to a line, which is never a bad thing, right? So Holiday looks like he's going to be an NHL player to me at this point. I don't know whether that's sort of a bottom sixer who's got some offense, or whether that's like a more of a middle sixer who's a real like contributor and power play guy and all of that. He's not going to be a PP1 guy, but could he be a big part of a second unit on the power play and chip in 40 points in a season? That kind of a player is what you're hoping for out of Stephen Holiday. And I think he's got enough offense and he's smart enough to potentially figure that out, especially because he doesn't have a lot of competition. So he might get an opportunity in Ottawa that he wouldn't get within another organization where they've got first round picks that they want to give those looks to, right? Like that's going to be a part of it for him. After Holiday, though, there aren't a lot of guys who've really sort of taken big steps. Like Boucher kind of is what he is. Zach Ostapchuk, you're hoping is going to be a sort of solid, rangy Nick Paul type bottom six guy. I don't think he'll ever be a Nick Paul level bottom six guy, but you're hoping that that's kind of the mold. That's what Zach Ostapchuk can potentially provide for you someday. Kleven's going to be a sort of steady third pairing guy who adds some physicality and size to your blue line. That's kind of what I imagine for him at this point. Levi Merlainen maybe becomes a goalie. There's a lot of guys you're just hoping become players, and there's not a lot of guys in the group that are going to move the needle or make much of an impact. So that's why these two picks are so important for them, because you're quite likely adding your first and second best prospect. In fact, I'd be shocked even if the guy they got in the late first round isn't a guy that I like in that range. He's still probably going to be their second best prospect after the guy that they got in the first round, right? So this is the start of them sort of really dedicating resources, I think, to building that pool back up to where it was 4 or 5 years ago, where we were all excited about Tim Stützle and Jake Sanderson and Ridley Gregg, and even before that, Drake Batherson. And they had a nice run there where they had legit guys coming, and now those guys are on the team, and the team is what it is, and they need to take a step collectively, but you need that next wave as well to support them, right? So that's what's next, I think.
Yeah, and I think trading a couple of first round picks in a row has really kind of set back their system. I mean, it's nice to hit on some guys like Tyler Kleven. I know at the time was kind of seen as a bit of a question mark because they traded up to get him, but he, like you said, looks like he'll be a bottom pairing defenseman, which Ottawa needs. And guys like Ostapchuk, even though there were guys, I believe Stankoven was still on the board when Ostapchuk was taken, but Ostapchuk and Ben Roger, can't forget Ben Roger.
Chandler Romeo.
At least he was like a 7, but and Holiday, getting him in the 4th round, in a draft where you didn't really get a lot, like at least there's a guy that kind of emerges there that you're getting some value out of. But all that to say, Ottawa has a high 2nd round pick this year as well. And so are there any guys who you can see maybe slipping out of the 1st round, or are maybe just, you would say, pretty good talents that are going to be available in that early 2nd for Ottawa?
Yeah, there are a couple of forwards that sort of really come to mind, frankly, in that range. As always happens, the 5'10", 5'11" wingers that have sort of 1st round talent, but teams just can't put their fist down on the table and draft in the 1st round. Those guys always linger, and I think there will be guys like that available. I could see Andrew Basha of the Medicine Hat Tigers, who played with Cayden Lindstrom this year, available in that range. Basha is a very, very competitive. He's a smaller player, 5'11", but he's strong. He's competitive. He plays with fire and energy. He's got skill. He's got playmaking tools. It's not hard to imagine him as a secondary playmaker in a top 9 with an NHL team in the future, which in the 2nd round is a great player. Guys like that, guys like maybe Tarek Parasak, who had 100 plus points this year, playing on a very, very talented Prince George team. A guy like Teddy Stiga, who really emerged at the NTDP.
Yeah.
He's a 5'10" winger. He's off to Boston College next year with his line mate from the NTDP, James Haggins. I think both of those guys could continue to play together, and if they do, I would expect that Teddy Stiga has an impact season as a freshman at Boston College, despite the fact that he's a 5'10", 5'11" winger. Those types are going to be there. On D, less so. I mean, not everybody's going to. I think an Aaron Kiviharju, who I kind of talked about earlier, could be there. Aaron no longer looks like a surefire first-round pick in this draft class because of the lost time. He's obviously a 5'9", 5'10" defenseman, which is always tough. There aren't many guys like that in the NHL these days, except for sort of the Quinn Hughes and the Sam Girards, like the really special ones. Now, certainly Troy Stetcher, and there are some other guys around the league who've done it. Matt Grizzlick's under 6 feet.
Eric Brandstrom.
What's that?
Eric Brandstrom.
Eric Brandstrom. Yeah, there you go. And there are actually some similarities between Eric Brandstrom and Kiviharju. I think Kiviharju is a smarter player than Eric Brandstrom is. Really the defining quality for Kiviharju is his smarts, but he's the kind of guy who could be available there. Cole Hudson, it's always the smaller guys at forward and on D, the smaller high skill guys that if they were a couple of inches taller would be first round picks, but teams just, it's really hard. It's easy to rank them in the public sphere. People like me who rank in Teddy Stiga. I think I have Teddy Stiga 31st on my board and Andrew Basha 29th or whatever. It's easy to rank them there. It's a lot harder to take them there. Now, Logan Stankoven, for example, who we just touched on, is different. I had Logan Stankoven 18, and he is a guy I would have pounded the table for in the first round. But those guys do linger. It's just inevitable. That's the way that the draft always goes, whether it's right or wrong. It's going to play out this year. It's going to play out next year. It's going to play out the year and a year, 2 years from now. That's the way it goes. So those are the guys I'd circle there because I think some of those guys can still become players, can surprise some people. Luca Cagnoni, who we briefly mentioned for San Jose, Luca Cagnoni was one of the 3 or 4 best defensemen in the CHL this year, not just in the WHL, in the whole CHL. He was unbelievable for Portland. And there's another guy, 3rd round pick, 5'10" defenseman. Is he going to make it? I don't know. He's going to have to prove it in the AHL. He's going to have to prove it in a camp. He's going to have to win over a coach. Those guys always have to prove it more than the 6'2" guy. But I think Luca Cagnoni has a real good chance to make it. And if he does, he's an excellent 3rd round pick, right? So those are the kinds of guys that I start to look at in those ranges. Because frankly, all the big guys who are good and talented and can skate, they're gone. They're first round picks, right? So you have to start reassessing the strategy, I think, in the 2nd and 3rd round. And I tend to look at some of those smaller guys at that range. You can get the 6'3" stud in the 1st round.
Yeah, sadly, from what I've heard, I think that most of the front office isn't big on small guys.
Yeah,
pun not intended. But yeah, it's unfortunate because I think Eric Brandstrom has had a couple of really strong defensive seasons on a blue line that has, I would say, for the most part, struggled to provide any consistency on defense. So that's a little unfortunate, but to see him go. But at the same time, you have Tyler Kleven on the way, who has looked good at the NHL level. And like you said, if Ottawa decides to go for a defenseman in the top 10, then I think that is really signaling a goodbye to Eric Brandstrom. But one guy I really wanted to touch on, and
I will say on Steve Staios, I got to know Steve in Hamilton pretty well. Obviously, that's my job. I try to build relationships with every GM in the CHL and head coach in the CHL, and I spoke with Steve a number of times over the years. And to his credit, he did not shy away from building that team with players that others steered clear of. You look at that Hamilton team and the way that they were built. Who were some of their greatest success stories? Arthur Kaliev, a player nobody liked. They brought in the Arbor Jacki, the kid in Montreal. Arbor Jacki was a very unique, different kind of player. There were a number of kids that were brought into that organization that didn't necessarily fit the sort of typical hockey player mold that most teams like. So I don't think Staios is maybe going to have. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to go out and draft really weird, quirky kids, but I don't think he's married to one specific type of player, maybe like Pierre Dorion was, where the Sens became, I got to be honest, and I've written about this a lot. The Sens became a very predictable team at the draft.
For sure.
You knew exactly what type of players they were going to like. It was no surprise when they picked Zach Ostapchuk, when they picked Ben Roger. Those were just their guys. Like those were their types. Even Boucher. Now Boucher was high, but he was their type. So I don't think Staios is necessarily going to have a one size fits all type. Like I think he believes that a group of 12 forwards can have all sorts of different shapes and sizes in it, and a group of 6D can have all sorts of different shapes and sizes in it. And I think he recognizes that. And I prescribe to that too. I mean, there are teams that never would have touched Phil Kessel, and Phil Kessel won a Stanley Cup with Pittsburgh because he's just one guy. They could have 11 workers, and then you can still, there's still room for a Phil Kessel in there, right? So I think he sees that too. And Arthur Kaliev was a great example of that. People hated his work ethic around the OHL. They thought he was slow and lazy and one-dimensional. And then he scored some big goals for that team and became a success story for them, and obviously an NHL player. And he's still figuring it out in the NHL and all of that. But I don't think Staios is as set in his ways maybe as people assume he is.
Yeah, and I wasn't so much trying to imply that, just like I don't think, like you said, with Pierre Dorion, it was very predictable with him and Trent Mann. At one point, they started to go for a certain type of player, and it got tired for sure. I think it changed slightly with the 2022 draft. They kind of picked more guys that were, different types. But it was more of a surprise when that happened. So I don't expect the same from Staios.
Yeah.
I know
I should add Logan Morrison to that list of weird guys too. Like Logan Morrison passed through the draft twice, was viewed as a slow center who didn't have the chops to make it, then had back-to-back 100-point seasons, was a most outstanding player in the OHL, signed with Seattle as a free agent, and was excellent in the AHL this year for Seattle, right? So he bet on some guys that other teams just weren't prepared to go after him, which I think is a nice quality to have in a general manager from a drafting perspective.
For sure.
That's how you end up taking a Lane Hudson or a, now you're not taking those guys every year maybe, but if there's one that you really believe in, if you want a Logan Stankoven or a Lane Hudson, I think he's prepared to go out and get that guy.
Yeah. And my partner is a Montreal fan, and I was at that draft with her, and when they picked Hudson, I was like, oh, that's a good pick. So but one of my personal favorite players of the draft, who I think will go around the 10 range, is Konsta Helenius, who you brought up earlier. Now, from everything I've read, he seems like a very complete player, very intelligent, maybe doesn't have one thing that stands out as being elite, but just does a lot of things very well. And also reading that he's one of those guys who has the potential, because of the way he plays, to potentially step into the NHL sooner than other guys. Is there a reason why you think that he's maybe further, not too far down, but further down the list than some of the other forwards who have been mentioned, like Iginla, who, might take maybe a bit more time to get to the NHL level?
Yeah, I think part of it is just a sense from teams that if you're 5'10", 5'11", like he is, now he's 5'11" and 180, so he's a pretty strong kid. And you see him, I ran into him obviously in Finland when I was there for U18 Worlds earlier this month, and like he's a pretty strong, like he looks like an athlete kind of thing. Like he's not a skinny kid like a lot of these kids still are. But the belief is if you're 5'10", 5'11", and you're a center and you're not fast, like you can't really move and skate, it can be hard, right? Or hard at least to be more than sort of a middle six guy. And if you're taking a player in the top 10, you want them to for sure be a top 6 center, right? So I think that's part of it. Doesn't have a big shot either. Like he's not a natural goal scorer, if you will. But I think the beauty of Konsta's game is the intelligence, one of the smartest players in the draft. He's also an excellent defensive forward, which at that age is very rare to see guys who really excel off the puck. A lot of them cheat for offense, and that's their game. Konsta has been committed to defense. He's done it against men. I spoke with Olli Jokinen, who was his head coach there this season and is now leaving to coach Timra in the SHL next year. But Olli believes that he's got a chance to compete for a job in the NHL next year just because of how many steals he comes up with, his puck retrievals, the battles that he surprises people and constantly wins. He's got an engine to him, really smart, crafty offensive player. I think had his season ended at the end of the Liga playoffs, he was excellent in the Liga playoffs, debatably their best player in the Liga playoffs. I think had his season ended there, he probably would have been what you're talking about, around 10. Since then, though, he wasn't great at U18 Worlds. He was good, but not great. He didn't dominate like I think people expected him to when he went back to his age group. Now he was still one of Finland's best players and a top center for them. And he played big minutes and he was a point per game, but teams wanted to see him just dominate that event. And that didn't happen. And then since then, after 2 excellent exhibition games against Latvia with the Finnish national team, he's actually, this is pre men's worlds, which is impressive just to make it at his age. The last players to do that were Capo Kakko and Patrick Laine. He's one of the youngest players who's ever played for the Finnish men's team. But since making it, his actual world championships for Finland have been just okay. Like he's bounced in and out of the lineup. He started as their second line center and then he was a healthy scratch. And it just hasn't sort of gone the way that I think he was hoping it would. And as a result, I think that plus the U18 Worlds, plus the fact that he's 5'11" and he's not a great standout skater. Now I think he's an average NHL skater. Like he's not slow. But all of those things combined, you're probably now looking at him, I think, sort of 13, 14, 15 potentially. Now, could a team really like him at 10 or 11? Sure. But I think increasingly teams will lean towards Beckett Senecki in that range, for example, or Tij Iginla in that range, or take another one of the D that's remaining in that range. And as a result, I think him and Cole Eiserman are just going to linger maybe a little bit longer than people expect. Like I think you could see them 13, 14, 15. That's where those 2 guys go in particular.
Cool. Well, I'm sure we could pick your brain all night, but I think we'll leave it at that. So thank you so much for joining us. And is there anything you wanted to mention before we end things off tonight?
No, not really. Just I guess June 3rd, my final top 100. That's the big one. I work all year on that. So looking forward to having it finally out there. I've got reports on like 85 of the 100 finished and half done reports on the other 15. So just a few guys I still need to make some calls on and watch some more tape on, and a few guys who I've got off the list that I want to make sure that I'm good on and that I'm confident they belong off the list. And other than that, it's done. It'll be out 10 days from now, more or less.
How many honorable mentions are we going to get?
No honorable mentions this year. The new
Okay.
format that we're doing at the Athletic with our new design. I don't know if you guys have seen the interface that they have for our draft rankings now that the design team has put together, but it'll be set at a hard 100. And then I have 15 to 20 guys that I've sort of strongly considered for the top 100 that I'll do as I always do. I always do a players who missed the cut piece with scouting reports on all of those guys. And those reports are also done at this point or almost all done at this point. So yeah, I'll have a second piece that comes out a couple of days after the top 100 that will have reports on the 15 or 20 guys that sort of missed it. And then I'll have an overagers piece and a goalie piece at some point to touch on some of the overagers and some of the goalies that didn't make the list as well.
Awesome. Thank you again. For everyone who is watching or listening, you can find Scott on Twitter at Scott C. Wheeler. Scott, appreciate your time tonight and enjoy the draft. And, a lot of work goes into this. So thank you for writing all this stuff out for those of us who can't watch 100+ players play.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Looking forward to getting down to Vegas for the last hurrah of the centralized drafts, which is a little heartbreaking for me, if I'm being honest.
I feel like it's heartbreaking for just about everybody, especially because, I think the NHL does it right.
Yeah, and I really don't think it's going to feel the same or even be as strong a TV product as it has been. So I have a feeling they're going to see the success that they have at the Sphere. The Sphere is going to be a major success. By all accounts, they've spent tens of millions of dollars on it. The production value is going to be really impressive, I think. I think they're going to knock it out of the park at the Sphere. The real question after that is, are they going to have regrets about the decision that they've made? I've already spoken to chief scouts and general managers who were amongst the sort of committees that voted for each team, right? Like the 32 general managers had to cast a vote on whether to decentralize it. And I've already spoken to people who voted in favor of decentralizing, who are second guessing whether that was the right vote. So, and I think more people will feel that way after Vegas, and how much fun it's going to be, how good it's going to look on TV, the press I think it's going to get from non-traditional hockey media. Like, I think ESPN is going to jump on it, and the visuals of what it's going to look like and all that. It's going to be a great few days for the NHL, I think.
And for you. So
Hopefully.
soak that up. That's going to be awesome. Scott, it's been a pleasure. Your work is loved by prospect nerds like Matt and I. So thanks so much for coming on, and hopefully we have you on to talk about maybe later 20 picks in the future, so we don't have to talk about top 10 picks as Sens fans anymore.
Yeah. Cheers, guys.
Have a good
Have
night.
a good one.